wonderful to see you all. Thank you so much for coming out. I'm very excited to be here for the second of the Wild Talks, which is a special lecture series to celebrate 200 years of ZSL. And I'm particularly pleased to be here because over the years, I've done a lot of work with ZSL. I'm if you don't know who I am, I'm Lucy Cooke. I'm a broadcaster and I'm an author. I've got a background in zoology, but these days mostly I write books. And my most recent book, Bitch, I hope that doesn't offend anybody, is all about how female animals were marginalised and misunderstood, thanks to Charles Darwin, who was a genius, but he was also a man of his time. And that meant that when it came to describing the female of the species, she came out in the shape of a Victorian housewife, passive, coy, and submissive. Now, we now know that female animals can be just as aggressive, dominant, sexually precocious as males. It's just that for over a century, scientists couldn't or perhaps wouldn't see them that way. And of course, it's really important that we understand, what females are really like and the role that they play in their societies, and also because that's often used to reflect back on us humans too. But one person who knows what female animals are really like is Dave Clark, who is the head of invertebrate conservation here at ZSL. And I know Dave really well. He has the onerous task of trying to breed endangered spiders in captivity. So there's a few chuckles there in the audience. It probably means that you know why this is no easy task. And that's because, of course, female spiders are notorious sexual cannibals. But Dave's valiant conservation efforts featured in the chapter of Bitch, which was entitled 50 Ways to Eat Your Lover. In spiders, it's the female of the species that is the biggest. And sometimes, in the case of this orb-weaver spider, they can be as much as 125 times the size of the male. So females live much longer, and they're the hunters. They're the ones that build the webs. They're the ones that have the fangs and have the venom. Males are really little more than wandering sacks of sperm. So when a male arrives on the female's web, hoping to entice her for a bit of how's your father, he looks remarkably like lunch, and this makes Dave's job very difficult. Because, he has to try and get these vulnerable males to mate without getting eaten. There you can see a male just desperately trying to avoid the fangs, probably with little success, of a female spider. And needless to say, Dave has told me that he suffers from a certain amount of performance anxiety when he is introducing the male into the sexual arena. But he has picked up a few tricks over the years. Rule number 1, make sure the female has been fed before you attempt to seduce her. She might still eat him anyway, because after all, eating the male is going to nourish the eggs that are inside of her. That's the thing, is that Darwin was completely bemused by this behaviour, and it's been a paradox for so long, but as is the case with Bitch, so many of these aggressively dominant females are actually just being good mothers and doing what's good for the eggs. But tonight we're not here to talk about badass female animals, we're here to talk about badass human female conservationists who work at ZSL. And I was really lucky to spend time with one in the field, and that is Dioren Smith. She has the job of protecting the pygmy sloth, which is found only on a remote island off the coast of Panama. The sloths, as you can see, they're pygmy sloths. They're actually half the size of normal Bradipus sloths, and I think we can all agree they're twice as cute. But, you know, protecting pint-sized pygmy sloths on a Caribbean island, you know, it kind of sounds like a really peachy job. But I discovered firsthand quite how tricky her job is when I went to go and spend time with her doing her annual sloth census. So, first of all, just getting to the island was a nightmare. It was just a teeny tiny boat, and the Caribbean is not just all flat twinkling turquoise seas. It was torrential rain, high seas, and I genuinely thought we actually blew off course, and I became quite tearful at one stage. It was really not fun at all. And then when we arrived, we were camping, and the island that we're staying on is uninhabited. There's just a few fishermen live on the island, so we had to camp. I had purchased my tent from a Panamanian supermarket 24 hours before the trip, which was ill-advised. It really wasn't robust enough. In fact, none of the tents were robust enough to deal with the onslaught of weather that we had to deal with. So I wound up sleeping and shivering for 4 nights in a puddle in that arrangement. The one with the purple top was mine. And then the sloths themselves, they live in the mangrove swamps. And the mangrove swamps are tidal. So 1 minute you're sort of, you know, in mud. The next minute you're up to your neck in water. And they're full of stingrays. So you have to wear these giant rubber boots in order to go through the mangroves looking for the sloths. And this is a little video that we made of me trying to deal with it. There was not a lot of dignity left by the end of the trip. Just look at the mud. And then, yeah, it was just really, really, really hard going. I sort of strained muscles that I didn't even know that I had on that. It was kind of like Glastonbury, but worse. So yeah, it was really difficult just moving around, avoiding the stingrays, and then you couldn't grab onto the mangroves because of the pit vipers. So there's like an inordinate amount, there's like a freakish amount of pit vipers in the mangroves. So there's this sort of deadly yellow noodles everywhere. You can't put your hands down. And of course, you know, if you get bitten by one, you've got to get anti-venom, but there's none on the island. So then you've got to do the torturous boat journey. And, you know, basically by the time you get to the mainland to a hospital, you're dead. So, you know, it was quite treacherous, the whole thing. And then there's the whole thing of like trying to spot the sloths. So you're doing a sloth survey, you've got to count every year, do the survey, see how many of the things there are. Anyone spot the sloth in that? There is a sloth in there. It's there. Yeah, they're really hard to see, obviously, because of the algae in their coats. That's their defences, to be really cryptic, and boy, are they cryptic. So, you know, I was really impressed by DRN. Like, just doing the survey was really hard work. But that isn't the hardest bit of her job, because DRN is a woman doing this job in a really machismo culture, you know. And so that means that it's not just, you know, she's the boss of men she has to work with, but she's also got to deal with government officials and be taken seriously by those men. And also she had to get on with and befriend and negotiate with the fishermen on the island, because the main threat to the pygmy sloth is the threat of tourism, and the fishermen, the Ngobis indigenous group who have ownership of the island, you know, it's a poor community. They don't make much money from fishing. You know, they want to develop their Caribbean paradise to casinos and hotels. So that's a really tough negotiation and takes a lot of listening to people and connecting with them in order to build trust and try and make change. So I was just really, really, really impressed by DRN. I thought she was an amazing force of a woman. She was steely, determined, warm and thoughtful, and I couldn't speak more highly of her. So it was really fantastic to get an opportunity to host this evening, and you're going to get to meet actual real life people like DRN tonight. So we're going to kick off first of all with Tina Campanella, who is the Bicentenary project manager here at ZSL. Tina has spent the past decade in the communications team telling stories that connect people to wildlife. We've worked together. In fact, it was the pygmy sloths, I think, actually, wasn't it? Yeah. Before joining ZSL, she was a journalist working across leading national women's titles, and she has a long-standing passion for sharing the remarkable, often overlooked women in ZSL's history, from pioneering scientists and conservationists to trailblazing zookeepers, and has championed the celebration of ZSL women as part of the organisation's Bicentenary celebration. So let's welcome to the stage Tina.
Thank you, Lucy. Yes, my name's Tina Campanella, and I am a ZSL woman. I'm not a scientist or a conservationist like Lucy or the amazing speakers who will follow me tonight. My role at ZSL is very different. As Lucy said, I worked in communications, the communications team here at ZSL for the past 10 years, and at the moment I'm planning our bicentenary, how we mark our 200 years working for wildlife. So, in a nutshell, I work with stories, with moments and memory, and that matters because institutions like ours are shaped not only by what we do, but by what we choose to value and remember. So today I'm going to talk about the woman whose work, courage and persistence have shaped ZSL, and whose legacy sits beneath everything that we'll hear from the remarkable scientists and conservationists speaking after me. Because the history of women at ZSL is not just a history of breakthroughs, of which ZSL has had so many. It's also a history of breaking barriers, of women who mattered long before they were fully seen. So first up, we have Sophia Raffles. Sophia Raffles didn't just help found ZSL, she changed fundamentally who it was for. She was born Sophia Hull in 1786. She was highly educated, widely read, and really deeply engaged with science at a time when women were mostly expected to just observe quietly. So when she married Sir Stamford Raffles, ZSL's eventual founder, she became his closest collaborator and advocate. But Sir Stamford died very suddenly in 1826, only a few months after ZSL was founded. And so Sophia didn't let that stop her. She stepped forward, she safeguarded, edited, and published all of his scientific work, ensuring that the society retained really important credibility in those really early years. She also made history. From the very beginning of ZSL, she was visible, she was vocal, she championed the idea that women belonged in scientific spaces as equals. Sophia became ZSL's first female fellow, leading ZSL to become the first learned society in the world to formally admit women in 1828. So Sophia Raffles was not a footnote. She was a ZSL fellow and a campaigner who opened the door for every woman at ZSL to follow through. Her legacy isn't just part of ZSL's history, it's the real bedrock of it. Next, we have the amazing Elizabeth Gould. And Elizabeth really reminds us that science advances not only through data, but through seeing. Her scientific illustrations made knowledge accessible, beautiful, precise. She was born Elizabeth Coxon in 1804, and she married ornithologist John Gould, whose work at ZSL was what connected her to natural history. She had really natural artistic talent, you can see with one of her images here, whereas he didn't. So when near the end of 1830, ZSL was sent a package of largely undescribed bird specimens from the distant Himalayan mountains, John Gould saw this as the opportunity to publish and really make his mark on the ornithological world, using this new technique of lithography to print the illustrations. And he had full faith in his wife's ability to learn this very complicated technique, because when Elizabeth asked, "But who will do the plates on stone?" John apparently replied, "Why you, of course?" She was heavily pregnant at the time, but she set to it. And over her career, she actually produced at least 650 plates documenting birds from Europe, Asia, Australia. Her illustrations were crucial in really defining works such as A Century of Birds from the Himalayas and The Birds of Australia, which remain definitive surveys of the birds in those countries. Two striking birds were named in her honour, the Gouldian finch and Mrs. Gould's sunbird. She even illustrated one of Darwin's books on birds, Zoology of the Voyage of the HMS Beagle. And Darwin actually praised her work in the introduction. So today we admire her art, but Elizabeth Gould didn't just illustrate birds to make books pretty. She helped the world see and understand them, and in doing so, she really built the foundation of modern ornithology that institutions like ZSL continue to advance. Now we're going to jump forward to World War I, where conservation at ZSL didn't always look like science or fieldwork. Sometimes, in fact, it looked like chickens. With so many men, including zookeepers, away in service during the First World War, Marion Saunders became ZSL's first female zookeeper. She led public education initiatives. She taught Londoners to rear chicken at home during food shortages. Her work really turned zoological knowledge into something deeply practical, showing that care for animals could support society during a time of need. It also reshaped the role of the zoo itself. During wartime, ZSL wasn't just a place for animals. It became a centre for public education, resilience, and shared responsibility. Her contribution may not have been loud or long remembered, but during the war, she helped Londoners do something quietly powerful: care for animals, care for themselves, and help sustain a city under pressure. Evelyn Cheeseman blazed trails in an era when women were largely excluded from science. Denied veterinary training because of her sex, she became a largely self-taught expert entomologist and joined ZSL in 1917, becoming assistant curator of insects in 1920, and was the first woman to hold such a post at ZSL. She revitalized the insect house, finding it barren after the war. She enlisted school children in collecting insects long before citizen science was even a concept. After leaving ZSL, she undertook 8 solo expeditions across the South Pacific, collecting over 70,000 wildlife specimens, writing 30 books, and describing dozens of species, some of which were named in her honour. Her courage was legendary. On one island, she spent hours disentangling herself from a giant spider's web, armed only with a nail file. Evelyn showed that scientific curiosity doesn't respect boundaries of gender, geography, or convention. She invited young minds into discovery, taught them how to observe and what to wonder about, and then went on to spend her life uncovering new facets of biodiversity. In 1955, when she was 74, she was appointed an OBE for her services to science. And she said in an interview, "We drop down or get run over, but we never retire." And she held to those words. She worked at the Natural History Museum, classifying specimens and writing until her death in 1969. After Evelyn came Joan Procter, who transformed how the world saw reptiles. Born in 1897, her early fascination with snakes, lizards, and even a pet crocodile that she took to school, much to the surprise of her maths teacher, led her to zoology, joining ZSL in 1923 as London Zoo's first female curator of reptiles. The media had an intense fascination with her from this moment on, based on her appearance and the species she worked with. The ZSL library is home to her cuttings scrapbook, where you can see reductive headlines announcing her appointment, including the words "power to charm." By one of these entries, she scathingly has written, "Most of this interview, which was refused, is due to an excessive imagination." Undeterred, Joan redesigned the zoo's reptile house, pioneering groundbreaking welfare features like differential heating and special glass that allowed ultraviolet light to pass through. She shared her knowledge globally through scientific papers and correspondence, becoming an international authority. And she connected with the animals personally to prove her theories that reptiles were intelligent, sensitive animals. The Komodo dragons she brought to ZSL particularly one named Sumbawa, would walk with her around the zoo, dispelling long-held Victorian myths and fears about reptiles as evil creatures and bringing people closer to nature. Sumbawa even accompanied her on a few council sessions at ZSL, which I expect helped her voice to be heard at a time when it was easier for it to be ignored. Joan tragically died very young at age 34, but her innovations shaped reptile care worldwide and helped shape ZSL into the expert authority on reptile care that it is today. She wasn't just ahead of her time, she brought the whole field of herpetology forward with her. And now we're going to take a step back. Because despite championing women from the start, ZSL hasn't always got it right. Despite the trailblazers who came before them that you've just heard about in the 1950s and into the 60s, female zookeepers were often referred to as pony girls, a term that quickly reduced their expertise to novelty. So ZSL has championed women, and it has also made mistakes, and both of those things are true. Christine Mary Hawkey joined ZSL in the 1960s as a research fellow, later leading the haematology unit for 27 years. Here at ZSL, Christine helped deliver what is still considered the most ambitious veterinary haematology study ever undertaken, building foundational knowledge of blood health across an enormous range of species. Along the way, she made a genuine scientific first. She discovered an anticoagulant compound in bat saliva, a breakthrough that transformed understanding of blood clotting and would later influence medical research far beyond wildlife science. Christine was prolific, publishing widely and co-authoring the landmark reference work, A Colour Atlas of Comparative Veterinary Haematology, a book that scientists still rely on today. She also worked in Sudan, studying water systems' effects on cattle and communities. Her science connected animals, people, and environments long before this interdisciplinary thinking was common. Christine may not be a household name, but wildlife science looks very different because of her. And now we have Dame Georgina Mace, who I know a lot of you are familiar with. Dame Georgina Mace helped the world agree on what extinction actually means and when to act. At ZSL, she co-created the modern IUCN Red List criteria, providing a shared framework for measuring extinction risk globally. Before Georgina's work, assessments of extinction risk were inconsistent. They were often subjective and difficult to compare. Species were being labelled rare or threatened, but conservation action was fragmented and uneven. She later became science director at the Institute of Zoology, where she championed the idea that conservation science shouldn't sit on the sidelines. It has to be embedded in economics, land use planning, climate policy, and in how society makes decisions. Her work has shaped policy, funding, and conservation decisions worldwide. She mentored generations of scientists, multiplying her impact. Georgina passed away in 2020 after giving the world a shared language for biodiversity loss and how to respond to it. So every time a species is labelled vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered, we see her legacy. And that brings us today, and I'm conscious of time, so let me just say I have in no way done any of these incredible women justice. Please do look them up and find out more about them. They have left us with a great responsibility to tell fuller stories, to name the women who shaped wildlife science, and to be honest about the language, structures, and assumptions that have shaped our past. The women I've spoken about today created the conditions that make the work that we'll hear about next possible. They pushed at boundaries, intellectual, physical, cultural, so that others could go further, faster, and with greater support. The women of ZSL did not all look the same. They did not all work the same way, and they were not all recognized in their time, but they all changed what was possible. So as we move into the next talks, from women at the forefront of science and conservation, let's remember that their work stands on foundations laid by those who came before them. If ZSL's next 200 years are to be even more impactful than the first, it will be because we continue to widen the definition of who belongs in wildlife science and whose work counts. I am a ZSL woman, and today we are here because of many others. Thank you.
Oh, Tina, that's fantastic. They're just amazing to hear about those women. God, I mean, really, really incredible stories. And yeah, Evelyn Cheeseman, she could teach Dave Clark a few things, I suspect, about spider mating. So next up is Dr. Heidi Ma. Heidi's interested in biodiversity conservation and pressing environmental issues in regions where a strong evidence base is much needed for making effective policies. Her research covers a broad range of species, including the Hyman gibbon, Yangtze, finless porpoise, the gorgeous pangolin, one of my favourites, and blue-crowned laughing thrush. She works closely with local communities, stakeholders and partners to achieve on-the-ground conservation action and benefits both people and wildlife. So let's welcome Heidi to the stage.
Thank you, Lucy, and good evening, everyone. My name is Heidi, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher here at the Institute of Zoology at ZSL. And it's a privilege to speak to you all today because actually doing research in wildlife conservation is really a privilege, and I realize that many women who perhaps would like to do this line of work might not be able to do this. So most of my research is focused on highly threatened species, and I work primarily in China and Japan. I've specialized in doing interviews with people and applying the findings to improve conservation of critically endangered species. So today I'll share some experiences and reflections about the value of women's knowledge in our conservation research. So before I talk more about the research, I want to take a step back and discuss some of the overarching ideas and questions that are central to the work we do and why we do it. So firstly, wildlife conservation is as much about the biology and ecology of species as it is about the relationships that people have with wildlife and their habitats. And we know that human societies are vastly diverse and interact with the natural environment in very different ways. So just like any other sector, there is a gendered component to wildlife conservation. And this includes everything from who gets to make decisions about governing wildlife and managing wildlife to who bears the costs and reap the benefits from conservation. And gender is recognized a long time ago, actually, as central to sustainable development. And this is why it ranks very highly amongst the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And secondly, we also know that who is doing the research and how affects the body of knowledge that we collectively gather and pass down. So Lucy's book is incredibly enlightening about the history of zoology, showing us that scientific knowledge, the knowledge that we have about animals, is really shaped by who gets to do the research. And these people are, of course, subject to their own biases, their culture, and their times. And that goes the same for conservation science. And assumptions about who is knowledgeable about what is constantly being broken with more research. So, for example, women are increasingly recognized to have a lot of knowledge about agrobiodiversity, about natural resource management, about climate change mitigation, and are sometimes the storytellers who pass on accumulated knowledge in cultures. And I think there's a lot more work that we can do in wildlife conservation to learn more about this. And finally, we know that there are interactions between gender equality and conservation. So inequalities in education, in access to resources, and in leadership roles limit the potential for women to contribute more in conservation. And we also know that women's, and especially young women's, empowerment is vital to sustaining conservation efforts in the long run. So the question is not about whether we need more women involved in conservation and research and to lead more, but it's rather about how we can break down the barriers to allow them to do so. So to give you a bit of background on the types of research I'm doing about ecological knowledge and how we use it to inform the conservation of threatened species. So ecological knowledge is someone's understanding of the environment, simply, and they can be subdivided into a few different categories. They have been studied for decades already in the environmental sciences, and they have really wide applicability. So, for example, local ecological knowledge is place-based and tied to someone's personal experiences of the environment. Traditional ecological knowledge is passed down through generations and accumulated over time. And indigenous ecological knowledge is specific to a group of people and their culture. So these are all incredibly useful for conservation because people who live near wildlife, manage wildlife, and use wildlife have a wealth of this accumulated knowledge that can tell us things about the species that oftentimes biological and ecological research methods cannot access. And it's also useful because the threats that we're trying to address are predominantly human caused. So to understand these threats, as well as find ways to mitigate them, reduce the threats, we need to engage with people who hold this knowledge. So to do this kind of research, it often involves having a conversation with someone that might look like this. So in my own work, we've asked about, for example, a species distribution, changes in their population, their abundances, and the quality of their habitats over time. In this case, we're asking about the Asiatic black bear, as well as indigenous knowledge about nature restoration and the recovery of culturally important species. In this case, it was the Blackstone's fish owl. And finally, we also sometimes ask more abstract concepts, like how extinctions are understood based on someone's own observations and experiences. So these are all really useful questions to answer for wildlife conservation. But more importantly, the process of doing this kind of research is really valuable in itself because we're directly listening to the people who we would like to involve in conservation and whose lives and livelihoods may often be impacted by the conservation decisions that we as researchers might recommend. And I think in these types of settings, in my experience, women researchers do have an advantage of being accepted and trusted by the interviewees. So as researchers, we know very well that what kinds of questions are asked, how the research is designed, and including how the data are collected and analyzed really influence the kinds of conclusions you get. So I had a bit of reflection on our own research, which has focused a lot on doing large-scale interview surveys, using standardized questionnaires, going door to door, doing household surveys. So in this case, we asked the same set of questions to everyone we interview and try to find patterns in their responses across space and time, or different topics. And in each of these studies, between 200 to 1,000 people might have been interviewed, but we often actually end up interviewing twice as many men than women, and in some cases, even more than 3/4 of the interviewees turn out to be men. Although we are aiming to get a balanced number of men and women, so why does this happen? Well, when we do household interviews, men are often the ones who are more willing to be interviewed or are introduced by maybe the village head, maybe the local authorities, or maybe even his own family members. And sometimes we use techniques such as snowball sampling, where one interviewee then recommends somebody else to be interviewed. And in this case, it results in more men being interviewed. Sometimes actually men actually do participate in the activities that we're interested in more than women, such as fishing, hunting, wildlife trade, and so on. So here's an example of a couple of examples from actually my own papers and those of my colleagues that concluded men, especially older men, have more ecological knowledge about wildlife, about sightings. And sometimes we make conclusions like we should direct more conservation, education, outreach resources to women because they might tend to have lower levels of education, or in our research turn out to know less about the local wildlife. But actually, we do know that the women are very knowledgeable as well. But this might not be captured in these sorts of surveys, these research methods. So, for example, men might know a lot about, might participate more in hunting and wildlife trade, but women in the same communities, can be very knowledgeable about the social networks that is very, very important for understanding wildlife trade networks and designing interventions. So we want to be more careful with how we do research and use complementary methods, both quantitative and qualitative methods, to understand more nuances. So in my work so far, I've often found myself in this type of situation, which I think a lot of people working in the same line of work often also find themselves in. It's not unusual, unfortunately. But in fact, we often work in these types of settings. There's a mix of my own interview work and our collaborations with conservation projects in China and Japan. And it doesn't take a lot of talking with colleagues to know that we need to incorporate more of women's knowledge in our research. We need more research done by women, and we need solutions that address the gender inequalities that prevent us from achieving these goals. And sometimes we really need to think outside the box a bit about how to do that. So I'm now going to show you a very vivid example to illustrate what I mean by creative solution and using more qualitative research methods to do this kind of research. So this is Jingyu Chen, and she's a social anthropologist who is researching the relationships between an endangered gibbon species, the Hulak tianxing gibbon, and how women's knowledge in the communities where these gibbons inhabit has guided forest restoration efforts into villages. And this is going to be the topic for PhD research over the next several years. So Jingyu will take you to this field site and show you how she's incorporating local women's knowledge and what supporting women's autonomy and encouraging self-governance really looks like.
Hello everyone, I'm Jingyu Chen from Cloud Mountain Conservation, a grassroots NGO in China focused on biodiversity conservation. And today I want to share a story between skywalker gibbon and a minority ethnic group people in China, Lisu people. As you can see, I'm dressed in a traditional Lisu costume because today is the traditional Lisu Lunar New Year. So we are celebrating for this new year. And I think it will be a special moment for us to sharing the International Women's Days and Lisu New Year together, sharing the story from local grassroots organization, from the local Lisu female and the skywalker gibbon. So let's begin with the landscape of the Lisu people and the skywalker gibbon. I think it will be a totally different story compared with the traditional conservation or ecological research. I would start from the Zumia area, a typical high mountain area zone in social anthropology perspective. And we can see in the heart of the Zumia area, on the boundary between Myanmar and China, this is where the Lisu people are located. And as we can see from the right map, this is what exactly the skywalker gibbon living there. And so it will be a totally different story, in not about the nature reserve area story, not just focus on the nature science-based conservation. This is a story between how local people engaged in the daily life with skywalker gibbon, how they join in conservation in their culture perspective, in their daily life. And nowadays, in China, we have less than 200 individual skywalker gibbon, and half of them living in the collective forest of Lisu people. So how can we conserve the majority of skywalker gibbon in China? The main issue is about how we can find the possibility between local Lisu people, their forest, and the skywalker gibbon. And compare with the typical quantitative ecological research, in our research we use more quantitative perspective, quantitative approach. It would more like social anthropology research. We use working with video, use participational mapping. So we join the daily life of Lisu people and finding what exactly their relationships with forest, their relationships with the skywalker gibbon, with their culture in that landscape. And after a long time field work and every day sharing with these people, we do find this power dynamic within ecological knowledge. As we can see in that picture, I'm working with a local Lisu female in her forest. There is exactly a cardamom planting under the forest. And in the traditional ecological research, the nature scientists usually think little people as they planting the cardamom in the forest, which causing the forest degradation and which then causing the population degrading of the skyward gibbon. But when I look into the daily life of little people, when I look into their culture, I find this narrative is totally wrong. Because the little people, they have built up relationships in their forest through a long way. Before the cardamom planting come into here, they don't have any way to make ecological product. The only way of them is slash and burn. So that way, slash and burn cause more damage to the forest than cardamom. So from the perspective of history, we should recognize in some way cardamom planting leading by these people, they save the forest for the skywalker gibbon until today. And here is an interesting comparison. You can see from the left, this is what exactly slash and burn forest. And in the middle, there's the remaining a grassland after the 20 years recovering. And from the right side, this is what exactly cardamom forest look like. When we find this power dynamic within ecological knowledge, we should realize when we come to conservation practice, their remaining power structure. This is a typical way when we see from the left picture how people organize conservation's plan, all male leading the project. And from the other way, what we do in our conservation project, female, the local little women, they are speaking. They are the people drawing habitat restoration. They are the people leading the canopy bridge building for skywalker gibbon in our community. So we build up the Eco-Public Affair Fund to support local little women, bring their leadership back to their community, and they are the people organize how to make the conservation project into practice. And we also care about the young women in these communities. They are the college students. They go to the big city in China. They are kind of distracted with their culture if they decided to live in the city after graduation. So we try to find a way connecting them with their communities through their education process, and we successfully encourage these young women join in the conservation project, and they are the translator, they are the bridge between our organization and community. And actually, Cloud Mountain Conservation, we are all women group. So I think it's amazing to share our story with local little women in a special International Women's Day. And I believe in future, our women power, our women perspective will improve and change the traditional conservation way. And we prepare a special video for our local little women group. Want to share something for all of you, and let's move forward together.
遇到什么事情都是一起面对，就很开心了。
灵山的长臂猿社区保护工作是通过妇女小组作为桥梁进行合作。拉满河寨的妇女组组长长相已经在这个职位上做了5年，她是非常有主意也有领导力的女性。
上任这个妇女组的时候，文化又低又不识字，所以这方面是很难的问题，最难的就是这个。对，兄妹是不是？比如说去
早上杰坦诚，她能够坚持下来，全是因为想到了她的姐妹们，以及对长臂猿保护未来的美好想象。
的样子，像这样子是不是？对，好像他们自由的样子。啊， 就像咱们自由的那种，就是早上的时候叫什么？早上的时候叫就是他们很自由的意思。
So the context to the last shot is that this women-led community conservation project is actually now starting to collect acoustic recordings of the gibbons that live just a couple of kilometers from the village. So that's why the mimicking the gibbon sounds. Yeah, just wanted to say thank you to everybody here at ZSL who supported this work, our funders, collaborators, and mentors who have supported me. So thank you very much.
Oh, that was just amazing. Thank you so much. I love those videos. It was so great to actually just to be able to go there and really, you know, feel the impact of that and get a sense of, it's so hard, I think, just to imagine what it's like to do these jobs, you know, and that you can really see the value of working with local communities there. It's amazing. Thank you. So next up, we've got Olivia Wilson-Holt and Dr. Lucy Archer. Liv works in ZSL's Conservation and Policy Directorate as a Human-Wildlife Coexistence Projects Manager. It's quite a mouthful. Supporting country teams in Africa and Asia with project implementation, strategy and design on human-wildlife conflict and coexistence themes, and promoting best practice measures and learning. She's got a master's in conservation science and has spent the last 7 years in NGO roles working in Africa, Asia and Latin America with teams of civil society organisations and researchers building knowledge and applying community-focused, locally appropriate interventions to tackle illegal wildlife trade, mitigate human-wildlife conflict and reduce unsustainable use of natural resources. And she's also a member of the IUCN Sustainable Use and Livelihood Specialist Group. It's quite a CV there, Lucy. Liv, sorry. Lucy Archer is an interdisciplinary conservation scientist with over 10 years experience working for NGO, governmental and academic institutions. Her main interest is in understanding the human dimensions inherent in biodiversity conservation and how local voices, perspectives and knowledge systems can be better represented in conservation planning to work towards collaborative, practical and inclusive conservation. Lucy co-leads ZSL's Fairer Conservation Programme, which she's going to be talking about tonight. So let me just welcome both Lucy and Liv to the stage.
Hi everyone, really great to be here this evening. My name is Liv, and as Lucy said, I'm Human Wildlife Coexistence Projects Manager in our CMP department.
And hi everyone, I'm Lucy and I co-lead ZSL's Fairer Conservation Programme, which I will be talking about in a minute.
And we're going to be talking to you today about conservation through a gender lens. So as Lucy said, other Lucy and I both sit in our Conservation and Policy Department. And here we work with many different stakeholders to address the major challenges to biodiversity loss to help ensure a world where wildlife can thrive. And our goal is to achieve the equitable recovery of wild diversity and abundance to address both the climate and biodiversity crises. And how will we achieve this? So ZSL works across 4 strategic pillars, and our work with women cuts across all of these. Whether that is ensuring we build local ecological knowledge into species recovery plans through the Protecting Species pillar, or prioritising local leadership and ensuring that conservation efforts are fair and equitable through our work to restore habitats. Or it could be supporting people from diverse backgrounds to become the next generation of conservationists to help drive nature recovery through the Training Conservationist pillar. Or lastly, tailoring our outreach to address local issues, such as linking conservation to livelihoods, health or well-being to help improve engagement and participation with underrepresented communities to create change. And so there are about 150 employees in conservation and policy globally, and 70% of us are women. We're active in around 50 countries. However, our primary focus is on Africa and Asia. and in Africa, working across savanna, forest, and coastal ecosystems through our teams based or working in Benin, Cameroon, Kenya, and Mozambique. And in Asia, we work across tropical forests, grasslands, mangrove, and ocean ecosystems through our teams based or working in Nepal, India, Thailand, Philippines, and the Chagos Archipelago. So just briefly, I'm going to talk about some of the key projects and programs that we work on and how we include women within these. So in Kenya, we target women in our projects to foster coexistence with wildlife and reduce key threats in the Tsavo landscape, including the wild meat trade. And we do this by empowering women as leaders in local banking schemes and diversified livelihood initiatives, and by facilitating safe spaces for dialogue with conservation officials to improve people-park relationships. In Mozambique, we empower women within communities to take a leading role within village-based financing mechanisms that help to diversify their income and improve protection for marine resources. And this approach has supported the recognition of locally managed marine areas within Mozambique law, paving the way for greater recognition of community-based protection. Over to some of our Asia programs, and in the Philippines, we partner with women in all aspects of our mangrove conservation work, whether that's through our training program, through local government engagement for policy change, and in science. And our scientific lead for mangroves, Dr. Primavera, is a nationally recognized female scientist, and we work with women's groups to establish and manage mangrove nurseries, which help generate additional income for their households. And then lastly, in Nepal, we aim to increase equal access to assets, resources, and capabilities for women and marginalized groups. And this includes equipping women through training and material support to become human-wildlife coexistence champions in their community. And this is helping to create linkages between communities and park authorities. And this is largely for the purpose of sharing information related to human-wildlife conflict and also building better people-park coordinated responses to conflict incidents. I'm now going to hand over to Lucy to take you through ZSL's FARA programme.
Thanks, Liv. So we've just heard from Liv on where we work and the types of projects that ZSL is involved in. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about why it's really important to be considering gender as part of our conservation programming. So for us, conservation isn't just about protecting wildlife, it's about understanding and working with people who live alongside that wildlife. And to do that, we need to understand how gender norms and barriers across the landscapes in which we work can influence what we do. And this is because gender can intersect with conservation in many different ways. So, for example, it can influence who owns and who has access to land and resources, who makes decisions about that land and resources, how we understand our local environments and the resources within them. So, as we heard from Heidi earlier, women can hold unique and specific knowledge that can be really useful and important for conservation. It also influences who might face barriers to engaging in conservation initiatives due to potential gender roles and responsibilities. And it also influences who might bear the costs and who might receive benefits of conservation due to the types of activities that we're implementing through our interventions. So, for example, in many of the contexts in which we work, women often depend on or are responsible for managing natural resources for household level needs. So, for example, managing water, firewood, non-timber forest products, nearshore marine resources. So risks such as human-wildlife conflict or climate change risks, or even restrictions that are imposed in the name of conservation, for example, protected area restrictions, can really disproportionately impact women if they have to find alternative ways to meet those household needs. So because of this, conservation can really impact genders quite differently. So if we continue to assume that everyone within a community that we're working with interacts with natural resources in the same way, we miss the reality and our projects are going to miss the mark. And missing gender considerations can not only impact the results of our projects and the success of our projects, but it can also create real risks for the women that we're working alongside. So without understanding these dynamics, we can risk reinforcing existing inequalities. So for example, if we're introducing new livelihoods, we might be introducing livelihoods on top of existing unpaid household duties and caring responsibilities that women are already doing. And in some cases where household finances might be controlled by men in the community, women might not be able to benefit from the earnings of that livelihood or decide on how those increased earnings are spent. So it's therefore crucial that we're considering all of those social norms and factors when we're designing those livelihoods. And if we fail to consider gender, it means that women's knowledge is lost. It means that ultimately half of the population might be left out of decision-making that ultimately impacts their own lives. And it means that conservation solutions might face resistance and local legitimacy. So ultimately, it means that conservation is going to be less effective, it's going to be less equitable, and it's going to be less sustainable, and therefore more likely to fail. So it's therefore clear that considering gender is crucial. And if we look more broadly across the conservation sector, calls for do-no-harm approaches have really been increasing over recent decades, with conservation science as a discipline really placing increasing importance on ethical considerations and human rights-based approaches. So understanding and incorporating gender can kind of help us on that pathway to becoming fairer and more inclusive. So at ZSL, we're working on this through our Fairer Conservation Programme. So Fairer is our internal framework which helps to embed equity, rights and social justice into everything that we do. And this stands for fair, accountable, inclusive, respectful, ethical and reflective. And it's an institutional programme of work that aims to not only mitigate the environmental and social risks that our projects might bring, but really to try and enhance the positive social impacts that our work can achieve. So through this programme, we're aiming to better deliver conservation impact, but whilst safeguarding and centring the local people and places in which we're working. So the framework itself is made up of our fairer values that I mentioned earlier, and it's underpinned by these three pillars of environmental and social safeguards, a fairer learning plan, and our fairer policies. And our environmental and social safeguards are the practical way, the practical tools that help us think through the diversity of ways that people and places could be impacted by our work. So from a gender lens specifically, these tools can provide a process to really understand how gender intersects with other protected characteristics. So how does it intersect with age, with ethnicity, with indigeneity and disability, and how that might in turn influence how someone is able to participate in our conservation interventions, or how they might hold power within their communities, or why they might be excluded, or why they may or may not be able to make decisions or have decision-making power. So, for example, in many of the contexts in which we work, Indigenous women often face additional and compounded barriers to engaging in conservation. So through this framework, we try and identify those barriers and risks that they might face so that we can try and design ways to remove them. So this is basically trying to help us design activities in a way that can facilitate engagement across all groups and provide a process to assess any unintended risks to different groups of women. So we want to go beyond thinking of women as a homogenous group and really analyse which women in particular might benefit or lose under certain different scenarios. So through these safeguards, if we kind of look at our project cycle, we kind of practically implement this through trying to understand local gender dynamics and social inequities, through understanding our power and our privilege that we might hold in different spaces. We then try and assess gender-based risks and put in place mitigation measures through things like risk and mitigation plans and management plans. We then identify opportunities to adapt our projects to try and address some of those structural inequalities. So we're working again to try and go beyond just including women, to think beyond representation, to try and make sure that women not only have a seat at the table, but that their voices can be heard at that table. And that might require us to work with men and boys as well within those communities to address social norms. We also try and work to ensure that women have safe ways to report any concerns or feedback to us. So making sure that we have grievance and feedback mechanisms that provide safe and accessible pathways to do that. And we also monitor our programmes through a gender sort of lens, which means that we can learn from and hear from the women that we're working with as to how they feel they're being included and how their voices are being heard. So in summary, Understanding gender really means trying to understand how agency, so how women might be able to make their own decisions and act upon them, how structures, they might be formal structures and informal structures such as existing social or cultural norms, and how different power relations can really shape who might be able to use resources, who might be able to participate, and who might benefit. And understanding that gender is not just about women, that we need to acknowledge that not all women share the same experiences, and really bring that intersectional lens into our thinking is really important. And moving forwards, we really need to be thinking about working with all genders to address problematic social norms and really promote positive masculinities. So ultimately, for transformative change moving forwards, we need to better work to address the causes of gender inequity rather than sort of simply putting sticking plasters on the symptoms. So I'm going to pass back over to Liv now, and we're going to hear from some of the many amazing women that have been working for wildlife across our country teams.
Thanks, Lucy. So yeah, we're now going to watch a short video which features insights from our colleagues around the globe. And I just wanted to introduce them properly before we watch the video. So the first of our video participants is Nol, who's part of our Philippines team, and she's a marine conservationist with experience in fisheries research, marine protected areas, and biodiversity mapping. She currently works as a fisheries biologist with the Philippines Seahorse Program, focusing on fisheries that impact seahorse populations and behaviour change approaches for sustainable conservation and fisheries management. We're also going to be hearing from Hannah, who lives and works in Wales as part of the Project Shark team. As the project's community, equity, rights and social safeguard specialist, her focus is on working with the partnership team to further their EDI literacy and supporting the identification and addressing of barriers to collaboration and engagement with both fishers and communities throughout project activities. And the aim of Hannah's work is to increase the inclusivity and accessibility of the work that Project Shark does. And lastly, we're going to be hearing from Frida, who is our Community Conservation and Environmental and Social Safeguards Technical Advisor for ZSL Kenya. And her work focuses on bridging conservation goals with community priorities through inclusive program design and results-based project management. And Frida leads initiatives tackling complex challenges such as human-wildlife conflict and community ranger relations, bringing together government agencies, conservancies, and local communities to co-design practical and locally grounded solutions.
Being a woman in wildlife conservation looks like bringing my lived experiences, my perspectives to the work that I do and to shape the conversations and the way I interact with the world.
Women are central to how natural resources are used, managed and protected at the household and community level.
As women, we bring empathy, resilience, and a different kind of listening, which all matter to conservation work. One of the biggest barriers that women face in conservation and leadership is taking up space.
I also used to lecture, and I have this distinct memory of walking into a lecture theatre and someone turning around to me and saying, "Oh, are you lost? Are you looking for your lecturer?"
My ideas or answers get overlooked, and then someone else repeats that, making you question yourself whether you should be in the same room with them.
And women's bodies are very different. This means that life jackets don't fit correctly. If you go to your general store, you might only be able to buy men's size steel toe cap boots. You have to order the women's size online, and it means they're less accessible.
Cultural norms, safety risks, harassment.
There is still unspoken expectations about who looks like a leader, who sounds like an expert.
These are structural barriers and they require institutional solutions. When women are excluded from conservation decision making, interventions often fail to reflect daily realities on the ground.
Conservation doesn't succeed in technical solutions alone. It succeeds when trust is built and sustained over time.
We must move beyond token participation to real power sharing by investing in women leadership, resourcing gender work properly, and holding institutions accountable.
We need to make sure that everyone's in that conversation. It can't just be the people that are facing the barriers in the first place, that are facing inequities, whether they're a woman or whether it's about another aspect of their identity. They can't always be the one that is advocating for change, educating others.
ZSL Kenya intentionally designs projects that recognize women's roles, risks, and time burdens through inclusive consultation, safeguarding measures, flexible meeting structures to account for their caregiving duties, and supporting women in leadership.
Being a woman in conservation is both empowering and deeply self-fulfilling. I just remind myself that I wouldn't be in the same room as them if I were incapable, if I didn't have anything valuable to offer.
Many have shifted from being invisible participants to being recognized decision makers.
Those that haven't faced those barriers, they might find that conversation really uncomfortable, and we have to sit with that discomfort. It's okay to be uncomfortable, but you need to listen and hear.
When women are actively engaged, conservation becomes more inclusive, more collaborative, and ultimately more resilient.
This will call for all of us to work together.
We need to make this change and these conversations about equity something everyone's talking about, and therefore everyone is making action to bring change about.
Thank you everyone for listening, and just a big thank you to our video participants and also our amazing comms expert Melania for pulling that fantastic video together. We hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Liv and Lucy. That was really, really fascinating, and another great video. So great to meet some of the people on the ground. Really special. Okay, we're going to get the chairs back up, and we're going to have some questions. We're going to do some audience questions. We'll start off with a bit of general chat, and then we'll hand over to the audience. I've got to ask you, really, where you are. What is it like for you being a woman working in conservation, and you know, in comms as well? You know, across the board. How do you find the experience?
I wouldn't be wearing the same clothes I would if I were going around London or going salsa dancing, you know, or doing other activities. So simply that, I think, is something that's so quite ingrained in us as women, is unfortunately, you have to change your behavior, in different situations. That's one. A good thing is I do see more and more young women willing to go to the field, mitigating the risks and just being quite courageous, and that's really inspiring for me.
I can maybe build on that about being a woman in the field. So before this current role that I'm in now, my PhD was looking at how we could use local ecological knowledge for pangolin conservation. So I spent a lot of time in the Philippines, and part of that was working with local people to use camera traps to monitor pangolin populations. So we had an amazing community-based team of camera trapping experts from the local community, and myself. But that team was all male, and then me. And that in itself, I think, brought lots of barriers, being the only woman in that team. Just like practical things, like where do you go to the toilet in the middle of a remote rainforest as a woman surrounded by 6-8 men? And kind of remember, like, thinking, I'm quite jealous that they can just go anywhere, and I need to be thinking about where I'm going to use the bathroom. So practical things like that, and perhaps earlier on in my career, kind of people assuming that because you're a woman that you're not going to be able to keep up with sort of intense field work through tropical rainforests and trekking for 8 hours a day. So maybe those kind of like subconscious biases are still quite prevalent around what we can and can't do as women working in wildlife.
It's also not just field-based activities as well. You know, we work in countries where unfortunately it is just unsafe to be a woman walking around a city by yourself. And so sometimes your traveling experiences are just very, very different to that of your male colleagues. And, you know, sometimes that can potentially make things a little bit awkward, or always mean that you're having to fit in with other people's plans rather than being able to, suggest an itinerary yourself, because they might just not have to factor those sort of considerations into planning. But I would also like to say, that we are so lucky at ZSL. You heard the statistics, 70% of women within our conservation and policy team are women. And a lot of those are in leadership roles, and they're very inspiring, nurturing, supportive women, and I certainly feel have created a very supportive environment for sort of more early career conservationists like myself.
Before I worked at ZSL, I was a journalist on national newspapers, and my first big break on a national newspaper was the News of the World, and it was on the news desk, which was unusual. Most female journalists, I mean, I'm talking 20 years ago, it doesn't feel like it's that long ago, were in features, because features was seen as, you know, fluffy, you sit and you talk with celebrities, whereas news was hard news. And so it was an opportunity, and I was so excited to go and do it until I realised that I was only there as a token female. They needed a female. They needed a female as a foil. And for a long time, I think that knocked my confidence until I realised that actually I could turn that around and turn it into an advantage. And I could be in the room, I could get in the room in a different way to how they got in the room. And actually, it was a strength. So I think you can turn things around, but it is very difficult when you come across that in the first instance. It can make you really question yourself. And I don't know whether, you know, as a woman, I think a lot of us suffer from imposter syndrome. We feel like we don't really know what we're doing, whereas men, and again, I don't want to generalize, but they feel like they have more natural confidence. And I think that one thing that we can do is all support each other to, you know, make each other realize that we do know what we're doing, and we can be in those rooms and we can have those voices.
Yeah, I can really relate to that, and I think I don't find it so much now at ZSL. As Liv said, I think we've got a really strong, supportive environment here. But I remember quite vividly one of my first conservation jobs being in a meeting room surrounded by male colleagues and kind of just feeling a little bit invisible. And I remember feeling like I'd be speaking, but that I wasn't being heard, and remember vividly kind of putting my point across and kind of just, you know, no one really saying anything. And then a male colleague practically saying the same thing a few sentences later, and everyone's like, oh yeah, great idea. And just so that, I don't know if it was because I was as a woman or because of levels of seniority or perhaps the intersection of the two, but yeah, I can definitely relate to that early experience.
I mean, that's why that program's just amazing that you're doing with empowering these women, you know, on the ground as well, to be able to feel like they can take up space and be part of leadership. I just found that incredibly moving and just brilliant, and really shows, you know, the sort of deep tentacles of ZSL work, you know, that you really need to kind of penetrate lots of layers, and you know, it works in all these different ways by prioritizing female voices, can impact in myriad ways. You know, it's a whole kind of web. So, yeah, really inspiring. I'd like to hand it over to the audience now, because I'm sure you've all got lots of questions. Does anybody want to kick off with anything? Yeah.
So, for those of you in the panel, I lecture in animal science, animal management. Our cohorts of students are 90% plus female. You know, amazing amount of female diversity there. Trying to take some wisdom back with me to those students later on this week. If you could tell your younger self something you know now to help empower yourselves, what would you tell yourself?
Who wants to start?
I can go. I think it would be that it's okay to take a massive risk. I, for my sins, worked in a finance job for 4 years before I decided to completely change career and embark on a master's in conservation. And never have I once regretted that, ever. And it can be an incredibly stressful job at times, but it's unbelievably rewarding, and you get to work with absolutely incredible people, as showcased tonight. So I would just say yes, and yeah, take all the risks that you want.
Yeah, so echoing what Liv was saying, opportunity comes your way, take it. Don't overthink and don't second guess yourself. Sometimes things just work out without kind of deliberating too much. And I think that's how sometimes progress gets made, is just, you have to screen out some of the negative voices and just push forward. Yeah.
I think I would say believe in yourself and the value that you bring to a space. And I think I can really resonate with kind of the feelings of imposter syndrome. I've always really struggled with that. But I think the reasons that you feel that, I think also can be a bit of a superpower, because I think it comes with maybe increased empathy and increased in consideration and maybe even a bit of overthinking, but sometimes that can be really useful in certain circumstances. So yeah, believe in yourself and the value that you bring to a space.
I'll quickly add one point is when I was an undergrad and doing my first kind of internship after undergrad, it was actually a project that had a gender dimension. It was about aquaculture in rural Bangladesh and about the diversity of fish and how women manage small ponds that had a lot of diversity of fish. And I would say that opportunity was kind of given to me. It was thrown to me, and I drew a lot of inspiration from the other younger women, older than me, but younger. Still very junior roles who guided me in the field, and I think that was my first kind of mentorship in a way, even though unofficially, and that taught me so much about the work I'm doing now, actually. But at the time, I didn't really think too critically about gender issues, what it meant for these young women in Bangladesh doing field work, doing research. I would encourage students now to just learn as much as possible about these topics. Now looking back, I think I was like super naive about things, but I learned through the process, hopefully.
Thank you. My advice would be, don't be afraid to fail. I think that as women, we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to be perfect and get it right all the time. And we want to get things right all the time. But the amount of wasted energy I think that I have spent on beating myself up for making mistakes, I think it's healthy to make mistakes. And actually, sometimes the greatest learning that you have is when you've made a mistake and you really unpick it and look at what to do better next time. So don't be afraid of failure would be mine.
Hello. Thank you so much. It's been really, really interesting. Something that I have always found interesting to ask women within this sector is how you manage having a family. So congratulations, Liv, you are pregnant. Do you find that you personally feel like it might be a challenge to have that support when you go off on maternity leave? Is there going to be the support when you come back? And for you guys who are doing that amazing work in the field, I really loved the idea that there was flexibility there for the women that can be care providers. Do you think that's something that needs to be implemented within our culture as well? A few nods there.
Very good question. Do you want to go first?
Yes. Yes, I won't lie that it's quite a daunting prospect. I guess my future new reality of returning to work and juggling childcare and a full-time job. So it is something that is currently playing on my mind. I'm lucky I have a very, very supportive family, which is not something that everyone has, and not everyone has family that live close by. So I'm very privileged in that regard. But yeah, hearing about other people's experiences and, the possible sacrifices that they've had to make, whether that's through working less hours or spending less time with their children. It is something that I'm concerned about in the future, but I'm hoping to enjoy my mat leave first and then deal with that when I come back to work. But yeah, it is something that plays on my mind for sure.
Yeah, I can speak to it. I've recently had a little one, and he's 16 months old. So I'm currently sort of learning how to juggle work and family life, and it is very much a juggle, and I think it will be a juggle for a long time. Even today, for example, he's poorly this week, so last night I was there thinking, oh my gosh, like what do I do? Do I stay at home with him, or do I come to this event here today? So even day to day, there's always dilemmas that you have to make and decisions you have to make around not prioritizing, but it's just a bit of a juggle. But like Liv, I'm really lucky to have a family close by who can step in and help, and a brilliant husband as well. So that helps. But yeah, it's definitely a juggle.
It would be great the childcare issue.
Yeah,
that's the. I mean, I think for it's the same. Doesn't really matter what job it is, does it really? But I mean, more so obviously if you're traveling a lot, because then if you're going away for long periods of time, you obviously don't want to leave your kids behind, and then you've got to have the fun. It'd be great if there was the funding to bring partners and bring kids, and it's something we can all hope for. Really, I suppose it would be the solution, I suppose, wouldn't it, to be able to do that, to have a world where you were able to do that.
It's starting.
It is starting. Well, that is fantastic news. That's great that there is that. I mean, that's also 70% of women, more mothers, more people thinking about how can we make this. We don't want to lose these brilliant brains and these, because this thing is, but once you become a mum, you get this, your brain actually changes and you become more empathetic. So you're going to be better at your job, So, we don't want to lose you just at that moment or after that point, for sure. Yes, over there.
Given, the state of the world and especially funding for conservation, how do you address the pressures sort of towards making gender considerations like performative, or also like the idea that, sometimes there's like being honest about failure and sort of the difficulties in trying to secure more funding based on that and sort of learning lessons, and that whole aspect of conservation and making sure that, there actually is impact, and when there is negative impact, also being able to learn from that experience.
Yeah, I can talk to that a little bit. So I guess that's really something that we've been really conscious with when designing our fairer conservation programme, and really wanting to not just be performative and really trying to make meaningful change. And I think we really wanted to go beyond kind of providing like tick box type activities to really understand how we can promote women's rights and embed them within the projects that we're doing. I think in terms of how do we learn from mistakes, I think lots of that comes through like how we monitor our programs and how we ensure that we're capturing women's voices in that monitoring. So actually asking them how they feel they're being engaged, if they feel their voices are being heard, and then being able to adapt our programs if they're not. And sometimes we will get it wrong, but we need to be constantly monitoring in order to do that learning piece and to be able to adapt. But I think part of what we need to get better at is being really reflexive and being able to really embed reflexivity in all that we do, and being really open and honest, and being able to have open, transparent conversations and saying that did work and that didn't work, because that's the only way we're going to move forward. But that's why, as part of Fairer, one of our key values is reflexivity. So we're really trying to not only do that through the framework, but trying to sort of change the culture within the organisation to promote that. So we have a learning plan that sits alongside our framework that really tries to promote that reflexive thinking and have those open conversations and make spaces that are safe and for all colleagues to kind of come together and do that.
I could add a quick point about that, in addition to what Lucy said. Funding is very important, and influencing funders to believe in some more experimental, more creative approaches is really important. Lucy, you mentioned that just now as well. In the women's community-based project that I showed earlier, there have been doubts from funders and external reviewers who might come from more ecological backgrounds, and they simply don't really buy into kind of the, local women telling them that a different way of planting trees and restoring the forest might work. So yeah, there is a lot of, sometimes a lot of friction that you might run into, and I think that's why also doing research on this is really important. Is you document it, you collect evidence, not only because it's an interesting academic exercise, but and because you have the hope that this evidence will show that things do work, and also show that things don't work. But if you have evidence, it's just much more persuasive.
So advice on how to step into leadership roles.
Storytelling.
And storytelling, yeah.
The best thing that you can do is tell stories in your everyday. And a lot of us now have access to social media. We are all journalists in a way. We all tell stories about ourselves every day. And I think it's a case of looking around at what stories there are to tell. And when it comes to getting into those kinds of roles, I mean, how I started working at ZSL was reaching out to the head of comms on LinkedIn and asking her how she had moved from journalism into comms. And I just wanted a coffee. I just wanted to find out how she did it. And she replied, and we had a coffee, and a few months later I ended up working at London Zoo, which I never ever thought in a million years would be something I would ever be able to do. So I guess my advice would be speak to people, put yourself out there, connect with people. Don't be afraid to say to somebody who is in the role that you would like to be in, how did you get into that position? Because it's likely that they won't have had some kind of direct route that you would imagine. I think we all end up taking quite circuitous routes to where we end up in our careers. So yes, put yourself out there, introduce yourself and speak to people.
Yeah, and I think I would add to that, as somebody who's sort of told stories about wildlife for, long time now, find your voice and don't be afraid of your voice. I think finding your voice and being proud of your voice is really important.
I remember someone telling me a while ago that men will look at a job description and think, oh, I've got half of that, and apply. And a woman will look at it and say, oh, I'm missing one thing, and won't apply. So I think also just believing in yourself that, that's just a list of things. You can bring so much more to a role than what's just written down on a piece of paper. So I think, taking a chance and applying for things that you don't necessarily think you're the right fit for, but that you might bring something extra and additional to what they're looking for, because all perspectives are valid and useful. So,
In Hillary's words, don't overthink it. Yeah.
Do you think you act as role models to the women in the countries in which you work? Because that must be a very important side role to your work, I hope.
You're probably all too humble to admit it, but...
I was going to say that actually I think it's the other way around. Often they are my role models and they inspire me every day. So we've got incredible teams of women working around the world. You heard from some of them earlier. And it makes me super proud to be working alongside them. So for me, they're my inspiration and they are my role models.
Yeah, well said. Very well said. Does anybody want to add to that, Hillary?
Yeah, that is definitely how I feel as well. Because I know how privileged I am to, get an education here, work here, access resources and funding here, and have, similar to everybody else on this panel, have supportive family members that, have enabled me to be here. So we might have a bit of a survivor bias here. But I am keenly aware of the challenges in other countries, other cultures, circumstances that that a lot of other young women are facing in their careers. So yes, I also respect a lot of their efforts. And I think now, as I start to work with more students and younger people, I don't want to think I'm already another generation, but it breaks my heart when really inspired young women in China and wherever drop out of conservation when they start really enthusiastic, but then they run into barriers and they drop out. That could be simply not finding a scholarship, to study conservation. That could be expectations to start a family. That could be financial pressures. Conservation is not a well-earning job here, let alone in a lot of other countries. So, I wouldn't say I see myself as a role model, but I do try to kind of support and encourage the young women that I work with, to keep them, to not.
I was going to say, that's like a big issue, isn't it? Is that there's a lot of women get involved, and then, as you say, there's having families and all these things that it's keeping those women there. I mean, I'm going to have to stop, unfortunately, because I know there's loads more questions. Perhaps there might be private questions asked at the end, but I've just been enormously inspired by your stories this evening. Really fantastic to hear the work that you're doing and how ZSL is supporting women doing conservation work. It's really, really fantastic. Thank you so much. I'd also like to thank you all so much for coming along this evening, and I wish we'd had more time for questions, but it's been wonderful to have you here, and I think we can all agree it's been fantastic to hear from these amazing, inspiring women. Thank you so much.